I would be, in the ACAB camp, while also recognizing that term, while it's fun and caustic and appropriately just like expresses the rage that you would feel that brings you to that position, it doesn't bring people over to that position.
Today is Friday, November 12th. The year is 2021. This is No Easy Answers, and I am your host, Jules Taylor. Today, like all days, I have no easy answers for you. Well, thank you so much for tuning in for another episode of No Easy Answers, a podcast about politics, philosophy, and the human condition. Joining us on the show today is journalist, musician, podcaster, and documentarian BZ Douglas, here to speak to us about his project called State of Injustice. Now, I recently met BZ while taking part in a live stream. As some of our listeners may already know, I recently made a GoFundMe to raise money for my mother's dialysis treatment, and my friend and comrade and podcast partner Max Alvarez was kind enough to host a Working People podcast live stream to help raise some money. One of the guests he asked to stop by was BZ, and that was how he and I met. Now, BZ didn't stick around for very long during that broadcast, but it was after the live stream was over when I saw that he'd given me a follow on Twitter, and so I went to his page to check out his projects. It was very soon after that BZ and I exchanged a few direct messages, and to tell you the truth, I was really blown away by the videos BZ has worked on for State of Injustice. BZ's work primarily focuses on police abuse, prosecutorial misconduct, and political corruption. And State of Injustice is a documentary series that focuses on the systemic failures of Ohio law enforcement. The initial 3-episode season explores police abuse in the city of Euclid, Ohio, and the lack of action taken by that city's administration. I have links to the website and social media for BZ and State of Injustice in the show notes. I'm also leaving links to all 3 videos. Now, these videos are short, they're about 15 minutes each, but I would highly encourage listeners to watch all 3 of those videos. After all, the point of this episode is to highlight the work BZ has done and the videos released by State of Injustice. I think if you watch at least the first video, you'll quickly find, just like I did, and I mentioned this during the course of the interview a couple times, but the videos are exceptionally well done, and they are most deserving of wider recognition and a wider audience. And I really enjoyed my time getting to know BZ and learn about his projects. I mean, he and I are both musicians, and we have a lot of things in common. And we spent a good half hour getting to know each other at the front of this interview, but I've cut that part out of the episode so we can get right to the heart of the conversation. But if you're interested in that part of the interview, you can find the full video of this interview at our Patreon. That's patreon.com/noeasyanswers. Check us out there if you want to become a supporter of the show and unlock lots of cool bonus content, including the video for today's episode. As always, thank you for your support. Thank you for listening. Thank you for recommending. Thank you for reviewing the show on iTunes or Apple Podcasts or Audible. Thank you for sharing these episodes with your friends. And, thank you for all the listener feedback and engagement with the show. Thank you for the donations and the GoFundMe. I mean, I have so much to be grateful and thankful for here. It's just really difficult to express the amount of gratitude I have for this platform and for the listeners and for the people that engage the content that I publish here. So just thank you so much. Let's get straight to the conversation with BZ about State of Injustice. You take all these spare parts you got lying around. You got microphones, you got cameras, you got marker boards in literature, you have community, and you have to synergize all this stuff together, and so in my case, with music, seeing that I had all the spare parts around to maybe record demos in my bedroom or to come out with an album that could be sonically on par with every other record in terms of quality, in terms of composition, all that stuff, right? So we look at all these different spare parts that we have and we create our own synergy. And the podcast for me was kind of a branch out of that. It's like, hey, you've done what you can with music. Not that you won't continue to do it, but you've been doing stuff with music. But what if you try a format that is not necessarily music as a primacy, but something that like it engages with issues at hand in the world? And so that what I'm getting from our conversation, just speaking with you for 30, 40 minutes at this point, just shooting the shit and stuff, is that like you synergized all this stuff in a way that resulted in some of the videos that you've released about police corruption in Ohio, or in Euclid, Ohio, or Greater Ohio. And, you know, I didn't understand that about you when I first saw the videos, but I have to say that the videos are just exceptionally well done. Earlier today, I went back and rewatched all three of them, and I took some notes around all three, because there were kind of specific questions I had. But you know, these videos, they looked like videos that they're way better than most of the videos that I've found trying to publicize this information. So kudos to you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So part of the reason why I wanted to have this conversation is because one, I think that we all see these videos online from time to time, and they're put out by various organizations, but so rarely do we get a chance to speak with the person who's producing these videos. So rarely do we get to hear about why they took this project on. And I'd like to discuss, if we can get to it, some of the inherent risk involved with producing and publishing this type of information. So can you maybe walk us through like the process that you went through in terms of choosing to take on this project and how the first video came about?
Yeah, it was completely organic, and I'm you know, hands-on pushing, just like learning by doing my way through a journalism career. And this was actually all set in motion only about a month after I had quit my job and said, I'm going to do this. And what it came from was just, I had decided as a beat to stay close to Black Lives Matter Cleveland. It was the summer of George Floyd. And my very first story was kind of calling out that they're one of the more credible organizers in our space, as just a local chapter, totally unaffiliated from the global network. They're actually critical of on a lot of things. So anyway, I'm close to them, and then I talking with the co-founder Kareem Henton, who I had a relationship with that point, and he mentioned to me, he's like, "Hey, so you're doing stuff. Do you know anyone who would shoot a video with about this gentleman, Luke Stewart, who's the subject of the first episode? He was sleeping in his car, and the police found a reason to kill him, basically." And so I said, yeah, well, I serendipitously knew through music, actually, by playing music, I had booked this one act who had brought this guy, Larry Elefante, in. Then when I moved to Cleveland, found out Larry lived in Youngstown, told him to come play a house show. He invites his friend Roger, that is my neighbor, actually moved into a house I looked at when we were house shopping. Roger comes to my party, and Roger is a feature film and documentary director. So I have him as a friend, and he's very much, you know, also like trying to spend time covering protests and throwing his skills at what's happening with the movement. So he's the first one I call and say, hey, he was one of the first people I reached out to on my first story as a quick divergence to Roger Glenn Hill. I can't plug him enough, because I was like, I had a story that I was just trying to like, someone should do this thing. And here it all is. And I eventually just came to terms like, okay, I got to write it. He put me in touch with like a local journalist who gave me gave it a look and helped give me a little credibility to pitch it to the place where it was ultimately published. So I kept Roger close on a lot of things. And when BLM Cleveland brought up the Luke Stewart story and said, how about shooting something about him? I organized a call with Roger. And what we initially set up was we were going to interview Luke's a family member, most likely his sister, the attorney for the family, and Richard Montgomery, who was a former mayoral candidate in Euclid and a very outspoken advocate for the community there in the city. And so the initial thought was just like, well, we'll produce a little 7-minute thing, and it'll be what the family really was hoping for was, and we weren't going to like charge anything for it. And for me, I was like, well, this is how I develop experience. Sure. You know, what is it to prepare for an interview with a family member of someone who was killed? That's a very tender, sensitive thing about what you really want them to delve into and whether or not you can get it from someone else, how to appropriately manage the time you have with people. And then I could have never done what Roger does, is he has the lights and the gear and the camera and knows how to just make it look correct and then take all this and edit it. So what I did once we had that, and we we're like, okay, well, we have them just all telling stories, and you know, he's a working guy too, and so at first it was just like, well, let's put a little bit of B-roll around them telling certain things, and then just say for more information you can help them here. And I feel like I don't know at what point it was just organically pushed into like, how about more? Because it really would probably just come up organically through, like, you know, we interviewed Kareem Henton as well for this, the co-founder of BLM. And so hearing him talk about this also happened in Euclid, and then Richard Montgomery doing the same thing, like, oh, just a few weeks after we had this case, and the lawyers, the same thing. And so as I'm looking into the history of this officer and realizing, you know, what would be great footage to put in this, the Euclid City Library has fantastic archives of their city council meetings going back to like the 80s, multi cameras and everything. So when I just was, you know, started looking at the dates right around what happened with Luke, and that's where I find, you know, when the family showed up to try and talk about it the same day that the officer that killed Luke was getting a commendation. Then finding the footage where people came and protested, researching on social media to find where, you know, what people had shared live from that. And that's where, like, for me, I just fell into that role for a documentary of, well, understanding that a producer is just like somebody like, well, let me get things done and make it happen. But then the role of researcher of just watching hours of city council footage and going fishing even too, to kind of like watch, well, what's a normal city council meeting like? Or maybe something was discussed relevant in the public comment, and jumping around and seeing resident after resident come in and talk about things, and finding little idiosyncrasies. If you watch it, you'll see when people are up to speak, there's this like guy that's kind of like leaning in. He's at every city council meeting. Every now and then he plugs some weird business venture he's on, but he knows where the frame is, and he just wants to be in every video.
Holy Christ, that's so funny, man.
So it really sprawled from just, I just kept digging in and then throwing Roger more stuff. And then when we came to, I said to him, he brought it up, like, we thought about shooting recreation footage because that's part of the issue of Luke's death, is they, against department policy, did not have any cameras rolling. And so we were struggling with what do we do with that? And that's where the synergy of like my work in the corporate world, which went from HTML to graphic design to programming, and then also motion design. And so I started doing, you know, the work of animating, just using like the photography we had from BCI, the investigative reports, and changing it from like day to night, and then creating officer silhouettes and just making it engaging enough to listen to audio and set a mood without having to like have whatever it would cost to hire a bunch of professional animators to do it, but giving it, you know, and if it has a professional polish to it, you know, that's what I'm living a bit of a dream with, just being able to take skills I learned on being polished and graphic design and all those things, with having to make nonsense for Citibank or P&G products and crap like that.
Yeah. Well, it does have a professional shine to it, man. You know, like I mean, I'm not kidding when I say those videos are really impressive. I mean, I watched them when I first was watching. I started episode 3 first, and for listeners, I'll leave links to all 3 of these within the show notes for y'all to check them out too. I would highly encourage y'all go through and watch them. They're rather short videos. I don't think any of them are over like 15 minutes, or they're all right around that mark. But in that short, like, I think I was less than 10 minutes in, and I was just, first of all, was outraged by the some of the conduct of Euclid police that you were pointing out. But secondly, I was like, you know, these are professionally made videos that like need to have more viewers, and more people need to know about this stuff. And you know, going back to your point of like, you know, figuring out that like they have multi-camera angles of every like city municipal meeting and stuff. I mean, this is the type of civic engagement I wish we could see more of, you know, where it's like, are you voting today? Well, you know, I'm actually going to get some video of this officer who just, you know, killed a person, receiving some sort of praise during a municipal meeting. I mean, all that stuff is contained within your video, but the fact that like you were saying, throughout this video, there's, you know, the silhouettes of officers, and there's bits of animation that give it this professional shine with the actual footage from municipal meetings. All of this placed into, I mean, it does not, the videos themselves are so well done that it does not reflect the sort of assemblage of spare parts that we've been getting to with like your friend that has the camera and the know-how with the lights and how to make it look proper. And then, you know, with the idea of like, oh, we're just going to stack some B-roll around this stuff, and then that organically shifts into something more than just stacking some B-roll around. And I don't know if listeners out there have ever had the experience of like trying to assemble their own movie, right? Like maybe they've messed around with like iMovie or something like that. In the winter of 2017, it occurred to me as a musician that you're not going to be able to release anything without video now. Like the world functions in a certain way, and that way as a musician requires you have a video component to your art. So I spent that winter searching through YouTube, through like Adobe After Effects tutorials, Adobe Premiere tutorials, Photoshop tutorials. I mean, all this stuff that like, I mean, I'm a set of ears, I'm not a set of eyes, you know? So I didn't consider it something that like, that I would, I mean, I was doing it for a specific purpose, which is like, I got to release a record. I got to, you know, have some video component for that. And, but all those skill sets have resulted in me knowing how to do a podcast now, and being able to edit video, or being able to produce working people and stuff like that. So I imagine that you went through a similar process in putting these things together, and learning how to do specific things within software that you didn't know how to do before. But for the result of that to be these videos that specifically point fingers at the police, at authority within your community, that highlight the stories of you know, bereaved family members, the tenderness to which you have to handle those situations. None of this is easy. None of this, all of this takes a lot of time. And I'm wondering if you could maybe talk to us more about, like, how did it go from just some B-roll, stacked around interviews, to the polished product there? I mean, I'm assuming you said you did the silhouette and the animation. I mean, how long did the first video take you to create?
I would say, you know, like we shot everything we were going to shoot ourselves over the course of just like scheduling the interviews over a couple weeks. And, you know, if it's an hour-long interview, then there's an hour of setup time and this and that in between. Then there's, you know, prepping for the questions and then syncing up. You know, we had 2 cameras for each one of those 2. And that's where, like, you know, again, so much credit goes to Roger Glenn Hill. I'm taking like an opportunity to, you know, pat myself on the back, because I am proud of a lot of the work I did on this. But at the same time, like, I could not have just taken the raw elements of this and made a flowing movie like he did. And he was good at reining me in, because I got to tell you, there's so much not in this that burned my soul up. Like, the Playmore could be a documentary on its own. This is a roller skating rink where it's in the episode 3 focuses on, and this was one of the things that, like, it was Black Lives Matter Cleveland who said, like, you guys, if you're going to do Euclid, you got to talk about the Playmore. And Roger, as a director, just kind of thinking he's like, we're missing something here and this and that. And so I, a lot of times would just be like, okay, let me think what I can find. And then also just keeping track of it. Cause initially we went in, we were going to tell an abbreviated version of the Playmore. Where it starts is, there was a big end of year high school event for teens that at this roller skating rink. They lock them in, parents drop them off, they have a good time. And there was about the owner he tried to secure the police to do security, and none of them signed up. So he hired his own people to just manage the line. So the cops show up while there's about 200 people in line this night. They walk in and they say, yeah, we just decided that your capacity is now going to be 250 instead of 400. And then they just go out and announce this to a bunch of teens. And then there's a lot of commotion as kids, act like kids and push to the front or whatever. And maybe a fight would break out. Obviously this sort of thing just seemed handled recklessly. If they really did think that they had to do that, why weren't they prepared for teenagers to be? But what they did was they started spraying pepper spray at these kids. And that pepper spray then went into the skating rink. And so everybody in there started running out. And then the police and the city tried to use this as a pretext to say, like, the Playmore is just out of control. Look what they caused. And they tried to shut it down. And honestly, it's like, I believe it's just, it's a Black-owned business. And what we show is that there's some severe, at best, indifference towards the Black community's plight under the police department there. At worst, there's tacit approval of what's being done by the police. So the Playmore was this historical story, and only footage that was live of the event was from the news. We couldn't get our hands of anything live that happened. But there is, on the State of Injustice YouTube, I did put the hours of testimony of skaters from around that all came out and supported this thing. And that was something that, I wish there was more of, but the reason we didn't need it is because after we'd already been paying attention and State of Injustice now we were ready to start editing the 3rd episode, the Playmore got taken to Common Pleas Court again. And this was my first time ever covering a live court hearing with gear. I had to manage it all on my own. Roger couldn't come. And I showed up not knowing I had to pre-register for a press pass in a certain way. Oh, wow. But the clerk was actually really helpful. I said, well, I'm doing a documentary. And I was told by the defendant I could come or whatever. And she called the judge and she said, oh, well, the judge actually, he doesn't do this, but he said you can go in. Oh, wow. And there's all the pandemic shielding up. So as a first time shooting, that was nerve wracking. They were like, oh, God. But what happened was they brought the owner of the Playmore in there to declare it officially a nuisance with the county. And who showed up at this thing was the mayor, the police chief, the law director, the assistant law director, captain of the police, all to talk about the menace of the Playmore. And the wildest thing that didn't get in here was the police chief, during his testimony, he brings up that there had been an alleged rape at the rink only the week prior. And has these sketchy, vague details about what happened, or that someone got drugged at the Playmore, went to their car, and then was taken somewhere else and raped. So the crazy thing, just watching this, and I remember I'm filming it and I just look up because it's dawning on me okay, you say you care about this crime, but the owner clearly doesn't know what you're talking about. why hadn't you canvassed the scene? The owner, in just moments ago in testimony, mentioned that he had cameras installed as sort of a showing a good faith. Like, look, I'm trying to make sure nothing bad happens around my property. So the police never, you're telling me a rape occurred there? And guess what? Weeks later, this whole thing went away. The person, like whoever they were talking about, recanted.
Wow.
So it's like they basically either they made up a rape or they turned some other incident into a rape and just tried to link it to the Playmore. And they threw the whole force of the city to shut down this place because they think it's such a menace. And what I hope comes across in episode 3 that we don't explicitly say is just pointing out that, you know, this is what the city is putting all this effort into, is this closing this black-owned roller skating rink, who at best has caused how much damage? How much peripheral damage did a bunch of teens running around possibly ever cause? They broke like 17 cars, 20 cars. It's not going to hit above 5 figures. Meanwhile, their police department on 2 incidents alone has cost the city and taxpayers $1 million in settlements. And they have done not taken nearly the amount of deliberation, thought, and action into fixing their police department as they have trying to railroad out the Playmore.
Well, you know, episode 3 really got me, man. And for listeners out there, when you go watch episode 3, as is pointed out within this video, you know, there are these teens at a lock-in, right? And they're going to lock them in this skating rink. It's like an end-of-the-year celebration. And they sort of spontaneously reduce the capacity from over 400 to like 250 or 200. And of course, when the thing, I mean, what gets me about this is that where are kids supposed to be dispersed to if they're dropped off by parents, as you point out in the video? That was the major point to me, is that, like, I,
as a parent, feel so bad for all, like, on a certain one level of just, you're thinking you had a night off.
Right.
Like, oh, I'm going to drop the kids off and me and, you know, we have our teenagers somewhere and we can go have a night. And suddenly they get frantic calls from the kids that had phones and that
they've been pepper sprayed, you know, by cops trying to control a crowd. I mean, it's so outrageous to me that, and even somebody else in the video as well says that you do not show like the sort of deference and dignity that towards children, as you just don't value our children.
That's Kareem Hinton, the co-founder of Black. That's
right.
Again, why I'll just like put a lot of, you know, always throwing a lot of credibility at BLM Cleveland, because man, you go into the foot, they've been showing up.
Right.
And
yeah. And I mean, and something else that like, and there was a lawyer in that video as well that mentioned something, I mean, he only said a few words, but it was something I've been trying to express personally for a while, in that like organizations form norms, cultures, and basic rituals. And so without a basic paradigm shift, they do not change. And so we were able to see how within episode 1, with the killing of Luke Stewart, you know, I mean, episode 1 was kind of crazy to me because like there is this, I hate hearing people talk about how like police need more training, when I think that if you are of the opinion that organizations form norms, cultures, and basic rituals, it's not a matter of additional training. It's about a paradigm shift, right? But when these officers turn on something called a takedown light, they're using this military terminology of a takedown light to sort of blind the person they're pulling over during a traffic stop so they can obscure them walking to the car. This person, Luke Stewart, was asleep in his car, and the first thing I hear about is how they knocked, and then the guy has him in a headlock. So there was no announcing of like who the police are. You're startling a man who's waking up in his car. You're not wearing the actual like police uniform. You're wearing fatigues, which don't express that this is like a law officer or something. It's just a guy in fatigue that's knocking on your window that suddenly has you in a headlock.
When you are waking up to blinding light making a silhouette. he could have been in like the full uniform, and it's still just going to be like, what?
Right. Yeah, I mean, this stuff is outrageous,
I would think
man.
And the training, and you know, with this story, the training really, you know, it's the training is emblematic of the culture, and especially with Euclid, because their in-house training revealed all sorts of inappropriate humor embedded in it, but also, you know, this was one of the things that was, for me, you know, felt like I was proud of as a journalist and a researcher, is just I went and read as many of the Euclid Police's annual reports as I could find. And one of the things I would find on that is what training did they take? And I don't know if you or your listeners this will ring a bell, but I found the bulletproof mindset was something that some of their officers attended, which is a program by the self-proclaimed pioneer of the killology field.
Yes.
And for this, you can I'll send it to you on Twitter. I did a mega thread, like 300 tweets long, of just watching his 3-hour presentation, and just, you know, documenting the brainworms as I saw them. Yeah. And I actually watched the 3-hour one I found of him talking to an Air Force base full of cops and law enforcement of different agencies. And then a more recent one he did during the pandemic. I registered for like a law enforcement conference, and he gave that whole thing from his living room with just like this wall of knives behind him.
Oh my God, dude. Yeah. The Dave Grossman and bulletproof training stuff. For listeners out there, Dave Grossman was at one point it was the most popular police training in the country. And his coursework is called Killology. And the folks out at Unicorn Riot did a really great thing where they published some of they published basically the entire training manual, and some of these like worksheets or so within that stack of within that PDF document they made public are just it's you have to go take a look at it. Maybe I'll save a note and link that in the the show notes or something, because like it's comical. It's like elementary school level, like fill in the blank of just stuff you'd never imagine, you know? Yeah,
and I don't know if I've ever actually gone through and, like I said, I've watched it and I've looked at that, but watching them together and almost how they would pair up, because what Grossman does is, like, first he just instills a whole lot of fear in them about the world. Like, he goes macro on, like, you know, this was in, like, you know, the presentation I watched like 2015, and so he's still talking about like the dangers we face and overseas.
Right.
But talking to this, getting all of the cops there in a militaristic mindset,
which Dave Grossman never saw in combat.
Coming home,
also, so yeah,
yeah, and then telling them, it's right for you to think you're always in danger, and then also justifying killer instinct and action. And he also goes off into a lot of some weird side tangents that not as probably the most valuable thing, if there's anything he does talk about. That when I've spoken to law enforcement officers or agents and who know of the training, and they're not as quick to just like dismiss it all, or like one thing they'll point out is like, well, he does talk about sleep deprivation being a problem, but then he's also one of the people that was the reason why video game violence got, like that. He gave the violence in violent video games are a problem. He was one of those pundits that would be there for TV to like say like, yes, wow, it definitely is. Not the training he's giving. That's never been, that's not a problem. No, it's the Call of Duty video games. Like, I'm not going to say that's not a problem at all. I'm priming you for violence and whatever, but at the same time, like, he's teaching people how to act on it and to really remain. And that's what the bulletproof mindset is. And he utilizes some psychology in weird ways where he talks about, hey, did you know there's a thing called like post-traumatic growth, where like you go through a bad thing and you grow because of it? But he kind of like dangles it there, like maybe, you could kill someone and become a better person.
Well, he also says something of there's some footage of him, really disturbing footage, where he's talking about how, like, if you were a warrior and if you were a person that is prepared to kill, then you should be able to kill and be all right with it. And that to me was was really disturbing
too. That whole paradigm. And that's how you'll know a Grossman acolyte,
right,
or someone who has really internalized. They will use the sheepdog rhetoric a lot.
I think that once Dave Grossman, once it was kind of pointed out that this guy was some of the was like the root of a lot of this sort of toxicity, and I mean, not that he's the total root of it, but once Dave Grossman was associated in his training with police brutality, I think it was after Philandro Castile in Minnesota. I think that's what brought attention to him. But after that, I think around that time we started to see this pivot for law enforcement saying like, oh, we have to go from a mindset of warriors to guardians. And it was like this softening of this overall Dave Grossman effect. I don't know if you know anything about that pivot afterwards, or why that verbiage shifted.
I wouldn't be, I'm not surprised by that. But the thing is, like, Dave Grossman, as far as like finding him on the Euclid training roster, that's just like he came to Ohio and they sent some officers there. And so that, and then like we said, like there's the training that was bad in Euclid. But what we actually stumbled upon in talking with the lawyer for Richard Hubbard III, Christopher McNeil, because he was in the military, so we asked him he knew about Grossman's thing, and so we asked him to comment on that. And then he said, you guys also need to talk to Mariah Crenshaw, she's the lead researcher and CEO of Chasing Justice LLC here in Cleveland. She's done work with like the consent decree team. She's just like self-appointed records queen, and she lives up to the name. Cool. And she is tracking an issue in Ohio where officers are actually, there was a law passed in 2007 by our state legislature that required the Ohio Peace Officers Training Academy, OPATA, to have a certain amount of what are called continued professional training hours in order to maintain like their status as a police officer. And these are things like, dealing with mental illness, stuff that people would want to see more of that's not focused on firearms or violent interventions, the stuff that they do a lot of. And what she found is a lot of them are just like in East Cleveland, for example, she got an audit to be performed and they had to pay back $10,000 because they claimed they took all this training and they didn't. What's more, she's found these officers who don't take this training go into a state of what's called cease function. And she finds these cease function letters in their file and also discovers they're not following the state law that says like they're not supposed to be officers at that point until they get recertified. So there's like this whole thing going on with like the bad training they are getting and better training that they're just completely neglecting, on top of like maybe just using all the training people when, people get excited about that issue and say, oh, we need better training. It looks like they're almost using it as like a slush fund to do whatever they want with, but they're not actually taking the training.
Yeah, I mean, the calls for additional training at this point have resulted in people like Dave Grossman just having a career, basically, and inflicting all sorts of harm, further harm. Not that, like, the training was very good to begin with. I mean, we see even in, like, it says very plainly in your first episode that officers had no training on how to, like, pull a person out of a vehicle, and it seems like they resorted to force before Luke was even awake, which... going back to the whole norms, cultures, and basic rituals, that's like they are trained to respond with violence. And so it is predictably so that they responded to even something like just a person sleeping in their car with violence. And you have people like Dave Grossman who are saying, hey, you are right to always feel yourself unsafe and to resort to violence, and that's your job, and you're a sheep wolf, you watch over the flock. And so it's really disturbing how all this comes down. In part two, can you tell us about how I caught something in there as I was preparing for this interview, that officers assault a man with a colostomy bag who was recovering from surgery?
That is the other case that shortly after we released that episode was when he won a $500,000 settlement also represented by the same attorney, I believe, that worked with the Luke Stewart family. So he was just a guy that was pulling into a driveway to make a phone call, being a safe driver.
Right.
And he pulled into the driveway of a house that the police were watching. And so they just rushed it thinking he was a shady person. And you can see in the video, he says like, okay, hold on. I just need to get by. And then they deploy the tasers on him before he can say colostomy bag. Wow. And yeah, I've watching that whole incident on the body cam footage to find the appropriate moments to show. But that was one of the hardest things to watch. Really like hearing the officer who did it then stand around while, this after they realize what they'd done. And they're like, okay, we're calling someone. And then the officer's just like, oh God, the smell. Oh, and like, shut up. Like, and feeling the shame and fear and anger of Lamar Wright. So and again, like that happened shortly before Luke Stewart. And then it was shortly after you had Richard Hubbard III was beaten in the street over a traffic stop where him like basically like turning around to ask a question was, the officer claimed that was him like stiff arming the officer and he had to suddenly throw him to the ground and kick him in the groin. So that was where it was pretty easy title to come up with, the landscape of brutality is because the first episode with Luke is really just focused on his story. Episode 2 pulls back a bit more, shows the story of Lamar Wright, Richard Hubbard III, and Shajon Gray, who a neighbor complained that her music, she didn't like this woman's music. And the police show up after she gets out of the shower and she's like, well, I got to get dressed. And they just barge in, pull her out with a towel on. And, and she's half naked at something. She also won a settlement. And then, by that third episode, it's just showing like where the police are showing up in high schools and roller skating rinks and a guy going to knock on a friend's apartment door. And in that story of Amarius Spencer, we were traveling in the wake of the Serial podcast, which is actually really excellent deep dive into the Cuyahoga County jail system. And several of we interviewed Amarius Spencer, whose story is a subject of episode 3 on that. Christopher McNeil, who we feature in 2 and 3, is in that as well. The only thing where I'll say as to how we approached State of Injustice that Roger and I were just both agreed on instantly is like, we were not going to be in this. Like, it's like, I wasn't, and that's why I listen to Serial now and I kind of cringe a little bit as far as I'll hear, this white woman, she lets a little bit of audio play of Chris McNeil, who's a brilliant attorney who knows this city and has some really good things to say. And she has audio of him about to talk directly to a police officer in like a community engagement meeting thing. And she lets him get started and fades him out and just explains what he says to her audience.
Oh, no.
Yeah. I find that very cringe. And so what we really is easy to adopt as how we tell this story is like, just let the Black community speak for itself.
Sure.
And that's why too, it's so great how many people did show up at those community meetings for me to find archive footage for. And I felt, proud of the opportunity to be like, well, you showed up and you hoped it made hopefully, I'm making your effort a little bit more worthwhile. And I'm glad you did it.
Can we speak a little bit about the binding arbitration thing that you mentioned in the video? Because I thought at first that binding arbitration had something to do or was just qualified immunity by another name. It seems like binding arbitration is something we have to fight as like a layer that's in addition to something like qualified immunity.
Well, that has to get to, just educating people on the fact that police unions are not the kind of unions that I think anyone on the left or for working class people should support.
Sure.
Like a police union, in my estimation, it should be advocating that like police officers have the equipment that keeps them safe that have like proper safety gear for driving vehicles, that they are getting good training to handle like dangerous equipment that they receive, especially or whatever. But what police unions largely exist as is to shield the police from any accountability for their civic duties. And that's where binding arbitration comes in. Like these contracts cities enter into with unions that say, well, this can only be handled in this specific way. And the reasons why they can't be fired that just come down to like, ironclad union contracts. And this is the sort of thing I'm finding in Ohio. It just seems like there is, in a lot of the worst cities, most problematic cities, there's a disturbing amount of deference and subservience to police forces that the more that I have realigned my focus, which just came out of becoming a journalist, realigned my focus to be narrowly on local stuff, you start seeing that like, oh, these national analogies where the city government and press is just as deferential to the police as the national political scene and press are to the military industrial complex. Oh, the general said this is a dangerous threat, so I just reprint that. Or the Secretary of Defense said we looked into this and we found no wrongdoing. Well, he's an honest guy. I got to print what he says. And there's not, institutionally in the media, I think it's not a shocking thing for me to say, I don't have any strong brand new insights into the fact that deferential posture exists for most mainstream going through the standard establishment channels of journalism. Because I'm in touch with some of them, but I'll notice like, they'll engage with me. I got some good responses to like State of Injustice as a project. But when I've put out like more of like my independent things that are very challenging, going hard at like my most recent one is probably the scariest story I'm reporting on because it's a prosecutor with a very lot of bad stuff alleged in his past that seems pretty credible enough so that I'm putting my name on the line reporting it at this point.
Sure.
But just also realizing, I think what I was initially saying is, as I've gone into this very much with a learning posture of like, okay, I want to learn the deep history of my local scene and seeing how much corruption there is. There's like, some of it is just legacies of, the KKK had a strong presence in this region. And then certainly the mafia in Youngstown, which came out of Prohibition. Mm-hmm. And so one thing that's been fantastic to pay attention to here in Cleveland and learn about is the Cleveland Oversight I don't want to get the name right, the Cleveland Police Oversight Commission, but they just released a presentation that was like studied 100 years of police reform efforts. And it had all these fantastic, like the opening line of this thing. And they're like real academic. So the data in it is incredibly incendiary, but they were just trying to be very like, look, these are just the facts we found. And man, out of the gate, their opening fact was, well, we find that crime just, it does its thing no matter how many police we have.
Nice. Yeah.
And
there's, it's like, I think it was Columbus, Ohio, when they had proposed a 2021 budget or something like that. This PDF was online, and somebody had posted a meme, which I thought was really clever and really drove the point home, which was like, at some point you realize that universities are kind of just like college football teams with an education side hustle. You find that municipalities are really just a police budget with a municipal side hustle. So the budget of the Columbus, Ohio police was projected to be more than the budget for everything else combined. And so to that end, I just feel like, man, like you're taking on a significant amount of risk, like stamping your name on this stuff, brother. Like, and it's courageous of you to do this. And so I wonder if, can you tell us about any sort of like, any sort of experiences you've had as a result of you putting your name on this stuff? Like, have you encountered any police that have known who you are at this point, or are you kind of like when you drive around? Do you worry about like cops knowing who you are at all, or
Well, yeah. Every fear I ever had, just as a news consumer who saw the police state and the surveillance state growing, and what would be done to people who challenge that. Frustrated by those who would say, well, if you're not doing anything wrong, then what do you have to worry about? And realizing that, there are people in my position. It's like, well, what I'm doing, wrongdoers think is wrong. And if they have the power to spy on me, intimidate me, I'm aware of that all the time, honestly. And I will keep friends in the loop about like stories I'm working, and just be like, just so you know, I don't drink to excess, and because I'm working a story, just to tease out one that's real. Like I said, it's really got me rattled with this prosecutor. In this one case, this woman was basically going to blow the whistle on all in court, testify in detail about the things that he had done in a case. She killed herself in her apartment the night before she was supposed to testify. And I've seen the scene photos. She apparently just bought 2 giant cheap bottles of vodka and then drank 3/4 of one so fast and furious that she died before she could even throw up, and just collapsed in a heap.
That's suspicious. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, there's no one in my 10. I told this story to like my kids in an abbreviated version. They're very much aware of like my work. It's part of like how I like as a white parent covering Black tragedies like this, just make my kids aware of like what Tamir Rice was doing. He's like doing what you're doing right now, running around with a dumb stick that could look like a gun, or even if it was a toy gun. But I don't hide them from this, but like you were asking about like the danger of it, it certainly puts me closer to like really internalizing to whatever degree I can as a white person. Okay, now I'm closer to living with the target on my back that, yes, I've just chosen to put there, but Black people would live with that target on their back all the time, just because they were born and they cross paths with an officer who doesn't know who they are. So yes, I do worry about that, but at the same time, my sources are thankful I'm working the story. My soul is a lot more satisfied, and my hope is to inspire more people. Honestly, a real frustration is just how much people pay attention to only the national scene, especially like Twitter and the discourse on a lot of things. I mean, obviously these are national pundits or whatever, but all of them gets in there's all these sides between I like this pundit and that pundit and whatever for their takes. But there's so much attention that needs to be paid in your local city. And you can do a lot of benefit just helping out and paying attention. And that's what I've enjoyed doing is because right now, right here in Cleveland, there's some exciting stuff just happening, and some stuff that needs paid attention to nationally, because we just passed issue 24, which establishes a civilian oversight body and augments the existing commissions that were just there in advisory capacities to now have a ability to actually like make firmer recommendations and things like that, and a commission that's made up of more than just a safety director appointed by the mayor. It's still got problems, or not problems, but it's one of those things that, and people have to realize it's like, this is a tool. So we got this tool now, we need to use it, pay attention to it. And the same thing goes with it. We have a brand new mayor, and the situation in Cleveland feels very analogous to like Obama versus Clinton, because our new mayor, Justin Bibb, completely upset the order here. Cleveland's very much there was an order that, and it was Kevin Kelly, the council president, was running, and he got defeated. And this machine town, that's a pretty big shock to the system. Right. And Bibb did that with really like stoking everyone's like, the local version of hope and change. Now, what I really hope people, and what I'm going to be focused on with him, is just saying like, okay, these are things that need to get done, and not tolerate anything that tries to say, well, we need to look forward and not backward, because there's so many lessons to learn looking backward and so many things to fix. And he's the one who will ultimately decide the success of this new board on issue 24, because he does most of the appointments, and city council has approval of them. So I think, though, the great thing about it is it diversifies, like, instead of just, like I said, one safety director, there have to be a certain amount of people with experiences with incarceration, who have been, arrested, who are in different backgrounds, and limiting the police presence on it to like 2 out of 7 or 6 on one of the bodies and none on the other. So, and the main thing is, we haven't tried this. That's why I was a fan of it. But going into it right now with, there's a lot of excitement in Cleveland between Justin Bibb and issue 24, but they need a lot of attention and a lot of civic engagement, I think, to be successful. But if they are, these are lessons that could have a ripple effect throughout Ohio and hopefully the rest of the country, because there's so many tragic lessons that aren't unique to here. But I'm getting into, well, what are the unique flavors that make up Ohio's corruption?
Well, there's a modicum of good news in there, thankfully. I mean, this conversation is talking about a lot of what we already know about how there's obviously corruption, and but when the way that your videos flush this stuff out, and the way the narrative is told, and the way you sort of you zone in on Luke Stewart in the beginning, and the way you sort of slowly pan out through the course of all 3 videos to show this as a wider corruption than just an acute case in Euclid, is fascinating. It's one leaves these videos with like maybe a renewed concept of how far down the ladder of depravity policing is as an institution, and maybe most emblematic of that in my eyes was the case of Donald Ivory. Maybe you could speak to that awful human being for just a bit.
That was insane. Just one of those, examples of this being a wild living beast of a project, because initially Donald Ivory was someone we had set aside as like, okay, we can throw this in there at some point, because he had a domestic violence charge against him, and Euclid fought to keep him on the force. And so then while we were working on this, and I was keeping, one of the things I was doing for this project was Euclid Police has a very vibrant YouTube channel. And they have lots of they would do coffee with a cop events a lot. And then during the pandemic, they started doing them on Zoom, where it's just 2 Euclid cops and the occasional one would pop in and chat with them. And I just downloaded all of them and would kind of randomly scrub. But then I saw that after the domestic abuse charge even had happened, they had Don Ivory on their channel reading a children's bedtime story in their like Books with Badges series. And so I snagged a copy of that. And then a couple of months later, he is indicted on charges of attacking sexually assault on a minor. And
so he was indicted for that.
Yeah. Wow. So he's still he's brought up on charges, and that's a pending case. We'll figure out where that goes. But so much. So, and I tell you what, I've often looked at what you see with the way officers get moved around in these departments, because barely any of the police live in Euclid that police in Euclid. Right. This is a common problem in a lot of places, but they also they just move them around like the Catholic Church. And that also will obfuscate things like problems in their training records, because the way that they are not centrally managed in this state, it's sort of like on each local agency to keep training records. And then they don't ever really have to prove that any training happened until someone starts looking.
Right.
But
And this goes back to like the thing you were mentioning with police unions simply being shields from that shields them from any sort of consequences to their actions. I mean, I was listening to a podcast recently. I don't remember who said this, but it was something that made me kind of laugh in it was really dark, honestly, but it was like, if you look at if you ever go on like police union Twitter and you look at the communication that comes out of that culture, out of that institution, you don't really find communication in officials, in officers of government. You don't really find communication that's the only way I can really describe it is like it's like if you're elected mayor or if you're municipal representative or something was actually like from the fucking WWE or something, like was just like professional wrestling is what the communication that comes out of like fraternal police orders. That's what that sounds like to me. I mean, that this even has a place within our government, within our society, within our discourse. Like it's ludicrous. And so, when I was watching this video and there's a cop that has been accused of assaulting a minor, a 13-year-old girl, and he's sitting there in a bulletproof vest reading a children's book. You mentioned, I think in part one, about how there were instances of inappropriate humor with this that the police was using around Rodney King and about their training and all that stuff, man. It is like beyond irony to beyond the pale and a sick joke to see an accused rapist of a minor reading a children's story. And this is what the police department is putting out on their YouTube channel.
Yeah. Like, we didn't cover like too, there's stories of, an officer who was, got into this really violent brawl in a neighboring community. And then they were going to discipline him and he ended up going into the headquarters and killing himself. That wasn't the first time either. There was another officer who was involved in, what looked like to be a pretty significant stolen evidence, stolen drug money scam, strolled into the headquarters and killed himself. And I've spoken with people who know police culture, and it's actually like, as much as suicide is obviously a societal taboo, it's really like drilled in, like you don't kill yourself at all. And if you were to go into the headquarters and do that, that's a statement. That's a very strong statement.
So you're saying two different officers went into police headquarters and committed suicide?
Yeah, over the court, like in two different isolated incidents in Euclid that happened. Wow. One very recently, and then like one in like 2009, I think, around there. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, police culture is so fucked, dude. Like I don't, I haven't even actually brought this out on the podcast, but I was raised by a guy who was a cop. He's not a part of my life. I don't talk to the guy anymore. It's like I was too young to know that he wasn't my father, but as soon as I was old enough to like put some distance between he and I was like, I can't even have you in my life, right? But I grew up witnessing this sort of almost like being behind the scenes to see like how police culture is manufactured, and a large part of that was actually just the show Cops. Because the thing that happens during the course of making that show is that they don't feature you and your arrest unless you make an arrest. So while they're filming this police officer in this patrol car, they will tell them that, like, hey, this person, we're not going to feature this story unless you arrest them. And they still have to get a release form signed by the person that is being arrested to use them on the show. And the camera crew will actually talk to the person being arrested and be like, look, like if you if you sign this release paper, we will work with you to get you some sort of leniency on your punishment, which of course the camera crew has nothing to do with that process, right? So all that being said, is that Cops is the longest running show on television, longer than The Simpsons. And Cops, over the course of generations, have watched the show Cops and taken in that information as in, like, this is how a cop should behave. And so they go out and replicate that behavior, and it turns into this very cyclical process. So to see that, cop culture being the way it is, the use of humor around their training and joking about Rodney King. I mean, we've seen some of the Facebook group transcripts of things that have happened after January 6th with, like, law officers and people using humor as well through that. The entire thing is really honestly, like, propped up by police unions. It's shielded from all negative repercussions by police unions. And we know historically police, grew out of strike breakers, breaking up the working class unions and stuff like that. So I don't know if you have any final words on any of this stuff, man, but I just want to say that your videos really impressed me. Your videos are so well done that I thought that we should have a conversation around all of this, because I think that your videos and your work clearly deserve wider recognition. And I think that I honestly found myself thinking, like, there are a lot of people in our lives that are not easily persuaded into the ACAB line, right? Like, a lot of listeners out there, maybe some listeners are like, some cops are bad, some cops are bad apples, and maybe it's like I found myself thinking, like, these are really great videos as a starting place to show someone who is of the opinion that cops protect you, who are of the opinions that cops are the good guys in society, and that you call them to solve crimes. Anyone who believes in these, like, easily disproven notions, I think these videos are really excellent to show those people in your life, to give them an idea of where you're coming from. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, or any closing thoughts, or anything to that end.
Yeah, well, I think as far as someone who does, I would be, in the ACAB camp, while also recognizing that term, while it's fun and caustic and appropriately just, like, expresses the rage that you would feel that brings you to that position, it doesn't bring people over to that position. And I think I really look to prove exhaustion, but also, like, you show a story like this, and my sources are people who are not completely anti-law enforcement. Like, they're like, but they're like, they have an idea of what law enforcement should be that I don't necessarily disagree with. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it should be, when people are like, we need police to, like, do, like, tell me the things you think we need police for, right? Okay, I agree. We need all those things to be done. Okay, we need to radically reform what this thing is. And if you look at a police department like Euclid, or any city where there's an obviously, if there's this many rotten apples, how is the tree not rancid and diseased at this point? And pointing out that if there are good cops in this department, they are trapped. Who do they talk to if they see a police chief that defends the most brutal, every officer that does every egregious thing, and you're not a wife-beating racist piece of shit? Like, right. You just keep your head down, or you will get out of policing entirely. And that's one of my pushback points with the fear mongering that went on around issue 24. And you see in other cities, they're saying, like, man, if you have an oversight body like this, the police are going to resign en masse. Good. If you're an officer, first of all, most of them are working class people, and they cannot do that.
Yeah.
Like, and the ones who can, good. Like, this is the kind of thing that scares you, is that you might have to be held more accountable to your actions. But also, it will signal to maybe decent people who would be getting into that job for public service, and not because they see it as a safe haven for their psychopathy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I really like, I mean, and part of the reason why why these videos were so interesting to me is you go from the micro to the macro, right? You pan out from Luke Stewart into the sort of broad 10,000 foot view that shows the sort of pervasiveness of the corruption throughout Ohio. Like, for listeners out there, I hope this can serve as like a tool to handy, like, you know, show these videos to a person who's convinced of like police do good in society and yada, 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 right? Those people that have these naive points of views, and you're trying to bring them over to I don't know, to something more aligned with how things really are. These are excellent videos for that end. But also, you know, these videos, if they show anything, I think what you're trying to show is that like this is not unique to Ohio, right? Like, this is something, there's probably something going on in your backyard, wherever you are in the United States, that has something just as shocking and vile and awful, you know? Like, I'm thinking of how, I mean, I live in the Hudson Valley, I live in upstate New York, and we just had an officer who was indicted on, I don't know if it was manslaughter or murder, because he pulled over a black family. They were going north from the city through Ulster County, where I live. He pulled him over. The man feared for his life. He had his wife and his child in the car with him. The officer deployed pepper spray. The guy, he sped off. The cop chased him, rammed his vehicle with his patrol car, causing that vehicle to flip over, killing a young child that was in the car. So he's now indicted on that. And they were paying this guy $173,000 a year was his salary last year. So, you know, when we talk about things like, we make statements like state-sponsored murder, or we talk about how black people have to live in fear of tax-subsidized murderers patrolling their neighborhoods. That's what we're talking about. And when we talk about training, like, how do you train a person not to ram their vehicle into a family vehicle, a sedan or an SUV? Like, how do you train that? It's how do you train that out of people is the question that I would pose to someone who would say, oh, police just need more training. You know, Alex Vitale has a great book on this called The End of Policing, in which he dispels certain notions, including the way that police, they have this way of appearing in society like they've already always been there. Like they're like this institution that goes back to the roots of you know, human anthropology or something, when in reality, they're a recent phenomenon that's only been around for 250 years or so. And so this institution does not have to be, I mean, it's contingent. It does not have to stay the same. It is not something that's already always been there. And we can change this. And that is something that, I mean, this new generation of abolitionists is awesome. It's like they don't want to reduce police. They want no police. You know, they don't want to reduce prisons. They want no prisons. So I think, you know, even though that it's difficult to imagine a society without them, without police, without these institutions that appear like they've already always been there, they're nothing more than contingencies to which we have not always had, and we do not have to continue to have. And we need to leverage our imagination in terms of civic engagement, in terms of how we can imagine our society, in order to create this basic paradigm shift that can disrupt the norms, cultures, and basic rituals of institutions. So I guess in rounding this entire conversation out, would you tell us where we can find you online, where we can find State of Injustice, where your videos are at? And of course, I will leave links for all the stuff in the show notes.
Hey, I want to just thank you so much for having me on and taking in the work and giving it all this attention. State of Injustice is at stateofinjustice.com. You can watch all the videos we've released. As far as what happens next with that project, I'm going to be in touch with Roger and Black Lives Matter and decide where we want to focus next. Because that project, I think the goal of it, you know, it spiraled from Luke to Euclid. And then when I coined the name of it, I said, well, I think if this has a rolling process, like we could just keep looking at cities, do a deep dive of cities, expose patterns. I would like to do appease a series that just looks at this training stuff I'm talking about. I would like to really do a series on prosecutorial misconduct and corruption, because that's the other thing that doesn't get talked about. We're talking a lot about police and defunding them. We also have to talk about the prosecutors who basically they're holding the leash of the police departments and sending them off to do this and that thing. And so to a certain degree, like getting police is like getting mad at the hammer. Sure. Getting mad at the gun, not the person who's pointing it to a large.
Of course, the DA is wrapped up with the police, and they're in cahoots with them. So by the time you go to trial, the person that's prosecuting you is already in cahoots with the police, and it's like this is not. I mean, I'm not a legal scholar, but to me, in my mind, that sticks out as something fundamentally biased and unfair. That is not impartial. That would, facilitate a fair trial. Yeah.
So with state of injustice, getting into like these sort of macro things is where that work is, and that right now is like I'm deciding on like what what I'm doing independently should I just be state of injustice, because I would like to be bringing in more people to work on stuff, figuring out how to like encourage new people to come into this and do citizen journalism, but. You can pay attention. I'm doing a lot of individual stories and coverage. My podcast tries to focus on really strong local activists. So, and still getting the musicians in and things like that. And my show is called Beezy Listening. I'm on YouTube as Beezy Douglas, and you can support me on Patreon. As far as just rolling individual support for my work. State of injustice, I think when we think of what the next big thing will be for that we do like project crowdfunding targeted to that. And the first one we did for that, we ended up kicking money back to Black Lives Matter Cleveland, because even though it says they executive produced this series, that really is just, they set it in motion. They gave us all the contacts, and they gave two white guys the credibility to step up and hopefully, help tell the story of Black oppression in this area.
Right. And something else I'm hoping that listeners pick up from this conversation is that, I started this podcast with a bunch of spare parts, and I think you picked up what you do through a bunch of different spare parts. Whether that was something you already had possession of or something that you came into through community, through your friend who had the cameras and the lights and had some of the technical know-how, to the contacts that you made through BLM and your local music scene, and the know-how that you have as a musician and having a computer and a microphone, and then just all of this coming together to form something that directly impacts the world that you live in, that you share with other people around you. I mean, I think that part of this entire conversation is something I would love for listeners to take from this, and to understand that they themselves have things at their disposal and skill sets that their friends or community have. And if they are willing to do something similar to what you are doing, they can likewise be impactful towards their community and all of these things. And so the DIY mentality, man, is just like, I'm getting so pumped talking to you, brother.
If you live in Cleveland, or if for plugging me, if you want to just support what I do because you got money to throw around, want to support a guy, great. But, and if you know people who live in Cleveland, pay attention, tell them to pay attention to me, hopefully, and I'll tell them who's good to pay attention to. But also find people in your community. I promise you something. If you're on Twitter's so much better when you make most of your follows that you pay attention to people who are doing real work in your community. And you'll see opportunities to I could step out for a day and help. Or there's a really the story that deserves a retweet and my effort on social media more than defending, whoever your kid, if you're Jimmy Dory, TYT, all the different the grays, everyone's on these damn camps of who they find credible online and arguing about it. And there's so much good work going on in your community. And that's been the most astounding thing I found as I've gone into this is why don't people know about you? And it's the same posture I had with the music podcast, where I just am you're just right here and everyone doesn't know about you. What can I do to fix that?
Yeah, well, that's kind of what I was, like I said, I was so impressed by these videos, man, and I was so outraged by some of the things that I learned about policing in Euclid and the greater Ohio area. And like I said, so rarely we see these videos circulate online at times, but so rarely do we get to speak to the person that, took up the effort to create these videos and is continuing to create them. And, my hat goes off to you for your work that you do. And I really wanted listeners to be familiar with it. And so if we can share this message online, if we can share your videos, I'm going to have all sorts of links to this stuff in the show notes. And, we'll go from there, and hopefully we can pick up some more traction and other people will become aware of. Not that they're already not aware, I would think, but like they're watch these videos, man, and watch these videos. And if you are a person that has spare parts out there, I hope you can take that from this conversation to assemble your own spare parts to create something similar to that. You're an inspiration to me, just like I created my platform out of just like the spare parts that I had. But I think that what you do specifically is courageous and brave, and like I said, I just think everyone needs it. Certainly deserving of further recognition, brother.
Well, I really appreciate it, man. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Well, that about wraps up another episode of No Easy Answers. As always, thank you for your support and thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with BZ Douglas. Go follow him online, check out his videos, and share that stuff on your social media. And in addition to these obvious truths about police misconduct, I hope that what comes through in this episode is the concept of piecing together spare parts. So much of the DIY mentality is built into who I am as a person. Whether it's building a 3-band show at a local venue, recording music in my home studio, and even this podcast. And I know that you have spare parts that you can make use of. And I know you can gather these assets and create something that can have a direct impact on the world around you. Now, I'm not saying you have to recruit a feature-length documentary director, high-quality cameras and sound equipment, or anything beyond the means of an everyday person. But what I am saying is maybe you have access to community. Maybe you know other people in your area that are similarly seeking to have an impact on their community and the world around them. All of us have these spare parts that we can synergize into something that is more than the sum of its parts. And I think it's remarkable and inspiring to see the way BZ has assembled his spare parts. And this podcast and this platform is the sum of spare parts that I assembled, and BZ and I are just everyday people. We just happen to take an asset inventory of things and items and resources at our disposal, and State of Injustice is a result of that, just like No Easy Answers. So I'm sure that you can do something similar. I recently had a listener comment something to the effect of that podcast listeners are not just looking for infotainment, they're not just looking for invigoration, but they're also looking for what the next steps are, or what to do with the information they've just received. Well, that's what I'm saying the next steps are. Find out what kind of spare parts you have, and what all might be done with those spare parts to have a positive impact on your community and the world around you. Until next time, take care, all my guys, gals, and non-binary pals. See ya.